So, as I mentioned, we're gonna come in with some plant basics. Now I'm gonna do some land plant basics, and then we're gonna get into the groups, but the groups are gonna be on the third exam, along with other stuff. But, so this should be the cutoff for the second exam, if I get through everything and something weird doesn't happen. So this is plant evolution, where you've got algae, you've got the branch off to, remember, plant kingdom is technically land plants. That the algae used to be included in the plant kingdom, and then they kind of booted them out into the protists. And then this branch became the plant kingdom. The plant kingdom would have originated here before, now it originates here. Taxonomy. We've got mosses, we've got ferns, we've got conifers, gymnosperms, and we have angiosperms. The mosses are called bryophytes, the tracheophytes are the ferns. See, mosses don't have internal tubes. That's what the vascular plants are, is that ferns don't produce seeds. That's this branch here. And then you get flowers that are that branch there, and we will come and walk you through those. But right now we're going to talk about some of the adaptive features that kind of set up the movement of plants onto land. Moss versus lichen, or as my daughter likes to say, lichen. They're on opposite sides of the stone. The first panel is, "Oi, moss, this is my stone." "No, it's not." 10 years later, "Get off. Who's gonna make me?" 50 years later, "That's it, I'm coming over." "Come on then." 100 years later, "You'll be sorry when I get there. You're the one who'll be sorry." So this is exaggerated in terms of, although lichens don't spread very quickly, mosses can actually spread relatively quickly. So not necessarily based in reality. Now, a lot of algae are planktonic, which means they float with this on the surface with the currents. But if you've ever been to the ocean, you know that there's algae that's in the surf zone. And for that, they need at least a certain amount of structure. They need to be able to hang on to the rocks. They need to be able to resist the beating of the waves. So even before they moved into flowing water, which would be freshwater systems, they already had some adaptations for the near beach, the near edge. I know there's a better word than that. Situation. So they had what they're called holdfasts and certain types of structure to kind of hold them in place. Now you already have cellulose. What you find developing there is lignin. Lignin contributes stiffness. And of course, eventually, plants out of the water lose the support they get from the water. And so they need supplementary stiffness. Lignin also can serve as a cuticle, a waxy covering to reduce water loss. Once you're pulling water up from the ground into the top of the plant, unless it's really, really humid, which it almost certainly was where plants first moved into the air, where there wasn't a lot of ability for evaporation because the air was already really, really humid. But eventually, you need to get into drier air, and you don't want to lose too much water. You're going to all that trouble pulling it out of the ground. You don't want it just evaporating away. What you also eventually see in land plants is the use of these bubbles inside the cells, vacuoles, to increase stiffness. They're like balloons, where using osmotic factors, they swell up this bubble inside the cell with water under pressure. And the pressure helps to hold the plant up. If you haven't watered your houseplants in a while, they start to wilt, they start to droop, because they start to use the water from the central vacuoles for photosynthesis. When they deplete the central vacuoles, they lose that part of their stiffness. So they don't get all of their stiffness from lignin and cellulose. They get a lot of it from internal pressures. That doesn't work when the plants get too big, and then you need additional stiffening for woody plants and larger plants. As plants move from the water onto the land, well, light's a really wonderful thing, but there is, as there always is, such a thing as too much of a good thing. And light, because it is energetic, can actually be damaging, is that there are what they call photooxidative effects. And so as plants got out of the water, which was reflecting a lot of the energy, or absorbing a lot of the energy, they needed to be able to use the light but not be damaged by the light. So there was some tricky chemistry to work out, getting out where the light is not really that impeded by the air. I was talking about pulling the water into the plant and then the water evaporating into the air. That has a special name. It's called transpiration. And a lot of the atmospheric water actually comes from plant water loss. Is that they can't necessarily, here's the problem. You need carbon dioxide to come in out of the air. You gotta open access to the air. It's really humid inside a plant because they're using the water for photosynthesis. As soon as you access the air, you're gonna lose water while carbon dioxide's coming in. As I said, in a really humid environment, not necessarily a big deal, but in drier environments, it becomes a major deal. And in certain types of dry environments, plants have worked out a different type of photosynthesis in order to lessen transpiration and to lessen photooxidative effects that they get from being in a dry, very, very sunny environment. But transpiration is a really big deal. Loss of water in any place where the water isn't that available is going to be a really, really big deal. And so you see things like waterproofing. I was talking about houseplants before. If you go and look at a bunch of houseplants, some of them are very waxy and shiny. The leaves are very shiny. Those plants come from drier environments. And that wax is a sealant on the surface of the leaves in order to lessen transpiration from the part that's being hit with the light and is warmer and is going to lose more water. But it doesn't lose it through the wax. It loses it through the bottom of the leaves because that's where the pores to absorb carbon dioxide are. And so you open the pores, water goes out when carbon dioxide goes in. But there are ways to get around transpiration. Water will move from a high concentration area to a low concentration area. Everything that can move will move from a high concentration to a low concentration area. It's called diffusion. And we'll talk about the details of that because it's a molecular process in the second semester. When water moves, because usually you're looking at things dissolved in water that are moving, it's kind of easy to forget that the more stuff you put in water, the less water is there. And the concentrations of water will cause it to move from where there's more to where there's less. The movement of water is called osmosis. A root in the ground. The cells themselves have less water than the groundwater. Groundwater is almost pure water. It's just rain trickled into the ground. So water will naturally move from outside the root where there's more of it to inside the root where there's less of it. Farther up the plant, once you get out of the ground, you have photosynthesis going on. The water's being used, the water's being lost through transpiration. The concentrations are dropping there. So water in the base of the plant is now moving from where there's more to where there's less in the upper parts of the plant. That's root pressure. The osmotic pressure will move water up the plant. But the same way that I'm feeling my arm right now, there's gravity. And gravity does pull back on this movement of water. So root pressure works fine if you're not getting too far off the ground. Maybe here, maybe here, waist level. Hard to get it that much farther off the ground using just root pressure to move the water up into the plant. For bigger plants, there's tube systems. The water leaving the leaves is literally exerting suction on water in tubes that run all the way down to the roots. This is called xylem. We'll talk about the terms. I learned it as xylem to the high plants and phloem to the low parts. Xylem to the high, phloem to the low. Water moves up through the xylem. Xylem tubes are very thick edged so that the suction doesn't suck the tube shut. Now stuff happens up in the top of the plants. Glucose is produced. Very important to keep the lower parts that aren't photosynthesizing alive. So stuff's got to go back down as well. Phloem are very thin edged tubes because there's no suction in them. It's just gravity taking the sugary liquid down to the bottom. In maple trees, it's going down through the bark. You can tap the bark and get the sugary liquid out of the phloem system. Is it just on the underside of the bark is phloem in those kinds of trees, in most woody trees. The xylem is the ring system that's adding a layer, or adding new cells. You get layers depending on seasonality. We'll talk about that later. So vascular system, xylem, and phloem. Early land plants, they were just using root pressure. Later land plants, remember on the thing, vascular systems, that allows for larger plants, leaves farther off the ground. Carbon dioxide. In ferns, there are pores in the green parts of the plant. So in the stems and in the leaves, there are pores. And the pores allow for carbon dioxide to come in and water loss to happen. I mean, oxygen goes out, but that's not that really a big deal. And so you don't tend to find ferns doing really well in really dry environments because the pores are open all the time. So there's a significant amount of water loss from them. In other plants, in the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, the more advanced plants, there are controllable pores, pores that can be opened and closed. It's kind of a neat trick where you have two cells facing each other, and these sides are stiff, and this side is flexible. And by pumping water out of the cell, you make this cell smaller like that, and this cell smaller like that, because that's the only flexible side. And now you have a pore that you can open and close by moving water in and out of the cell. So you can open it when you need to, you can close it to reduce water loss. And as I mentioned, there's a special type of photosynthesis where it can run more effectively with the pores closed. Plants that live in particularly dry, sunny environments, you're gonna lose too much water, dry. You're also gotta worry about photooxidation. So another issue with the pores closed and photosynthesis going on, there's more and more oxygen building up inside the leaves. Oxygen has potential dangerous chemistry to it, oxidation. And so there's a certain type of photosynthesis that reduces the impact. Again, you don't need to know that. It has to do with C3 versus 3,4, stuff in the cycle and the molecule numbers. You don't need to know that. Just that there's a special type of photosynthesis to kind of get around these issues of carbon dioxide needs and water loss, which are always fighting each other. We talked about nitrates and symbionts. Little buddy bacteria and fungal inclusions. Remember lichens? Lichens are a combination of algae and fungus. The latest big thing about lichens is just how many species are there. Used to be one species of algae, one species of fungus. Now there's some debate from genetic tests as to whether there's actually more than 2 species there, maybe additional species of fungus. It's a commensal system. Isn't really considered a colonial, because colonials are members all of the same species. When you put different species together, you get different names for it. But the fungus is fixing nitrogen and phosphate. The plant part is actually taking carbon dioxide, making fuel, and together they can basically grow on rocks. They pull minerals out of the rocks, carbon dioxide out of the air, water, usually from dew and rain. They don't have any roots or anything. In more advanced plants, you're getting the water out of the ground. There's air around the bottom of the plant, whether it's roots or rhizoids, which are kind of root-like systems without vascular systems. And that's usually where your symbionts are. And they're taking N2, double nitrogen molecule that's 3/4 of the air around us, being really, really stable. It's built up over the last few billion years. But they will pull the nitrogens apart, add some oxygens, usually in a couple of steps through nitrites and nitrates. And that feeds the plant. It keeps the plant alive. The plants give them food. It's a wonderful thing. And they do call that fixation. As living things moved onto the land, they originally the only type of soil that would have been there would have been erosion, bits and pieces. Maybe not exactly sand, but not organically enriched. So not a lot of nitrates, not a lot of phosphates. But eventually, as things started to be able to get a foothold there, the lichens and some of the early mosses and such, then they would die and they would break down. And the carbon compounds that originally had started as carbon dioxide in the air were now carbon compounds in the soil, more accessible, more usable for plants. So you've got your decomposers, you've got your bacteria, you've got your funguses, helping to break down dead stuff and reconstitute it into the covering on the ground and produce what we would consider soil now, that plants pretty much depend on for at least some of their nutritional input. We talked about reproduction types. There's a certain amount of asexual reproduction in plants, but for the most part, plants are sexual reproducers. Or they're both, which we'll talk about very, very soon. But what you also typically find in plants is a particular setup of genders. Genders, and I'm going to tell you this terminology is in a state of flux. Is that I'm starting to read that what I learned as genders is now being called sex, and what I learned as sexes is now being called genders. I'm not really sure where we sit on this, so I'm going to stick with what I learned originally. But you may find that you're going to have to learn it the other way around. It takes a while for this stuff to settle down, and sometimes it changes permanently, and sometimes it just shifts for a while. This has a lot to do right now with transsexuals and the application of these terms to human beings, and so eventually, hopefully, that ceases to be a big issue, and so these terms, from a biological standpoint, may kind of revert back to what they originally were. But as I learned it, genders are roles played by participants in sexual reproduction. Is that you have two sources supplying one set of chromosomes, another set of chromosomes. What are the two sources doing? Are they doing the same thing? In which case there is no gender, they're both contributing with the same roles. This happens in a lot of funguses where they both just they produce nuclei with one set of chromosomes, they swap the nuclei, put them together, and now you get a cell for the next generation. Both sides doing the same thing. And then funguses go, wacky the other way, where depending on the conditions at the time, they can perform a whole bunch of different sets of roles, up to 30 and 40 different ones. Only one pair at a time, but the classic gender that you find much more commonly in living things is the one that we're used to, is male-female. But male-female is only one example, even if it's the most common one. It's only one example of how to do genders in sexual reproducers. So what makes things male and female? It comes down to the gametes, the cells that they make. You've got sperm cells and egg cells, technically called ova. And the first difference is really the main difference. The female gender is specialized to giving the offspring a head start, giving them enough food to get going till they can actually provide their own food. Really important. That leaves the male a different role. It's not going to provide food, so it doesn't need to build really, really big cells. That leaves the sperm as the seekers, because when you're building a big cell with food in it, it's not going to be terribly mobile. So mobility comes from the other side. The sperm cells have a way of getting to where sperm have a way of getting to where the egg cells are. We think of swimming. That isn't it. Some sperms swim with flagella, some of them swim with cilia. That's very, very rare. Some of them crawl. In a lot of plants, sperm are packaged into pollen, and pollen is how they get to where the female is. And there's all sorts of different ways that pollen mobilizes to get to where the egg cells are. Well, if you're going to put the sperm out there to try to find the egg cells, then you better make a whole bunch of them, because the odds are not good for them. So you make way, 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 way more sperm than you make egg cells. And on the other hand, egg cells are expensive to produce. You're putting a bunch of food in them. You can't afford to make lots and lots and lots of them. So fewer egg cells, more sperm. This is a comparison within male-female species. There are species where the egg cells are produced in the hundreds of thousands, but then the sperms would be produced in the millions. So this is a comparative number, where this is always going to be a much bigger number than that. But this sometimes is a pretty big number. The process that makes these cells makes 4 cells. It's a division process. You actually start like you were going to divide regular cells, which means you've already duplicated your DNA. So you've taken 2 sets of chromosomes and duplicated it, so you have 4. You need to get down to cells that only have 1 set, because you're going to get a set from here and a set from here. So you're going to make 4 cells. You started with 4 sets of chromosomes. You got to make 4 cells. Well, with sperm, you got to crank out lots of them anyway, and they don't have to be very big. So you divide the cells, and you wind up with 4 working sperm for every starting cell. And of course, way, way, way more starting cells. Egg cells, why would you take your food and divide it into quarters? That's not a great mode of survival for your offspring. So you want to hold your food all in 1 cell, but you got to do the divisions. You got to get rid of extra sets of chromosomes. They can't hang out in the cell. And so the division happens, but 3 tiny, tiny little cells that literally just hold chromosomes are made. Now in some angiosperms, we'll talk about this later, so far as I know, dicots in the angiosperms are the only things that do anything with the polar bodies other than just use them as discards. But we will talk about that later. Typically, the polar bodies are nothing. They're tiny little cells. They don't survive very long. They don't, most of the time, don't really get to 3 because the first one is supposed to divide to produce 2 more, and it often doesn't. But this is the process of differences between sperm and eggs. Some terms. In species where individuals are both male and female at the same time, they are monoecious. Lots and lots and lots of plants are monoecious. Some animals are monoecious, where there's both male parts and female parts. How do you know? Because one part makes sperm and the other part makes egg cells. Now, there's an awful lot of species where the males and the females are separate individuals, like us. And there's a bunch of animals, and there are some plants where that's true. They are dioecious. This is connected to what's in the cells. If sperm and eggs have 1 set of chromosomes, that's called haploid, sometimes monoploid. And regular cells have 2 sets of chromosomes, those are diploid. When you take a haploid sperm and a haploid egg cell and put them together, you get a diploid zygote, first cell of the next generation with 2 sets of chromosomes. And as we've talked about earlier, and we'll talk about again, there are some things that use sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Very often, male-female sexual reproduction, and of course, there's no gender for asexual reproduction. And they go back and forth and back and forth. And plants, land plants especially, early land plants, this was their method of getting out of the water and being able to reproduce using sperm that swim, which was not a great thing for being up in the air. So we will see this applied to the mosses and the ferns, the bryophytes and the tracheophytes. That's it for this chapter. I know it went kind of long, but I wanted to fit this in. This is the cutoff point for the second exam, and we will then pick up the groups, the bryophytes and such, for the third exam.